Ruth. So the five scrolls are the book, the Song of Songs, the book of Ruth, the book of Lamentations, which is attached to Jeremiah, and it's really a poetic expression of the laments of Jeremiah, seeing what is happening to his nation. The book of Ecclesiastes, and we'll make a bit of a reference to that in this session. And the book that tells the story of Esther. So Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. They are the five scrolls. You'll find on page 78 of your book that those are listed, and an approximate date for when those books might have been compiled is given in the middle column. You'll also see that there's extra columns headed Apocrypha and the dates of these books in the Apocrypha. So you can see that for each of these books that form part of the writings in the canon of the Old Testament, there were other old Jewish books that existed that are collected in the Apocrypha. So, for instance, as well as the 150 Psalms in the book of Psalms, there's Psalm 151, and there's the prayer of Manasseh that are included in the Apocrypha. And of course, if we go beyond that into the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a whole lot of other Psalms in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's not just the books that are in the canon that the Jews had. With regard to wisdom literature, there's a couple of really interesting books that we won't be covering in this course, but the Wisdom of Solomon, wisdom literature attributed to the great King Solomon, but probably written 10 centuries after Solomon's life, and then the book of Sirach, also called Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes. There was a reading, for those of you who may have watched or seen excerpts from the funeral of Prince Philip. Recently, there was a reading from the book of Ecclesiasticus, and one of my learned biblical scholar friends in England put up this post saying how terrible. The commentator called it Ecclesiastes. It was actually Ecclesiasticus. He was very upset about it. But anyway, if you have a book with the Apocrypha, you could have a bit of a look at those. Both of those have stuff about wisdom, which is really good, but we're not heading down that track. Alongside the five scrolls, there are these other books like Tobit, Judith, additions to Esther, Baruch, and the letter to Jeremiah that are included in the Apocrypha. You'll see also that this chart on page 78 includes a reference to apocalyptic literature and to the chronicler's history. With regard to the chronicler's history, that's the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. We're going to come back to some of that at a later point in the course. We're not spending any time on that at the moment. Those books are technically history, but they are in Jewish tradition are included in the writings. And then you can see that there are other Jewish books like the 4 books of Maccabees and the 2 books of Esdras that are lumped there. With regard to apocalyptic, those of you who did the New Testament course will remember that we talked about apocalyptic when we looked at the book of Revelation, and to some extent this also informs the way in which Jesus went about his preaching and talking about the kingdom. So there's an explanation of apocalyptic, which should ring a bell to you if you did that course, on page 79. And that is put in here because apocalyptic really provides quite a contrast to the way in which wisdom literature operates. The bulk of the books in the writings are actually wisdom literature. And apocalyptic is about revealing what God's new heaven and new earth is going to look like. It's about the coming kingdom of God, usually written in very difficult political, social circumstances as a vision of what the promise of God might be. But you'll see later on in page 79, this paragraph that says, when Israel was not in crisis, the prophets were quiet. The daily routine of life preoccupied most of the ordinary people of the land with mundane questions of how to get along in life. Simple questions: how to discipline an unruly child, how to teach children what they need to know, the dangers of gossip and slander, the need for hard work and to provide the necessities of life. Why is it that wicked people seem to prosper? The arrogance of sudden wealth. All interesting, good questions, and a lot of them very practical stuff about daily life. So that's what wisdom is really about. It's about helping people to grapple with those mundane, ordinary, predictable matters in daily life. So on the top of page 80, there's a list of the 4 basic characteristics of Old Testament wisdom. That wisdom is concerned with everyday life, how we are to live well, the relationships we have with one another, how to live harmoniously. And the book says that there is an assumed commitment to God. There's no explicit discussion about God and God acting. It's just assumed right throughout that we're living in a society, in a time, in a culture where God is understood to be present. So wisdom does not appeal to revealed truth. It tends to describe life as it is, rather than say, this is what the Lord said you should do, rather than be prescriptive like that. So that's in contrast to the prophets who are saying, thus saith the Lord, or in contrast to apocalyptic, which is saying, sure, this is what life is like now, but it's going to be much better in the coming future. So wisdom is about learning enough to be able to choose the proper course of action for well-being in life. And we've looked at the beginning of Proverbs, if you look at the first Psalm, you'll see that sets it out quite clearly. There are 2 ways. There's the way of the wicked and the way of the righteous. And Proverbs is all about choosing the way of the righteous, not the way of the wicked. And Psalms is all about celebrating the way of the righteous, not the way of the wicked. So it's a simple kind of analysis of life. Wisdom does not appeal to revealed truth, but its claim to authority lies in tradition and observation, the patterns of life that have served us so well over the decades, indeed the centuries. Wisdom represents the wisdom of experience, individual and collective experience. And wisdom in ancient Israel is rooted in a reverence and a commitment to God. So human beings need to search the wise, the appropriate, the righteous way to live. All of that flows from the notion that God has created the world and has given the world a way to operate, and it's up to us as human beings to seek out that way and to put it into practice. So that's what your resources offer in terms of what wisdom is about, and how that is then expressed in a number of those books in a variety of ways. So we thought that we would just pick up on a couple of the shorter wisdom books and ask you this question. What well-known proverbs, a proverb is a short, pithy saying. What well-known proverbs are contained in the book of Proverbs? Anyone have a thought?
What about a fool and his money are soon parted? Is that in there or
that's
not?
the one John predicted would come up.
But it might be Shakespeare. You know, I get confused.
That's true, actually. People do attribute some things to wisdom that are actually from Shakespeare.
Mm.
I like Proverbs 31, verse 10. A capable wife who can find.
Oh, yeah?
She's more precious than jewels.
Have you looked at what she's doing? Is that what you
Yes.
want to spend your days doing? Honestly.
Any other proverbs that come to mind?
I was reading this yesterday. A fool spurns a parent's discipline, but whoever heeds correction shows prudence. Proverbs 15, verse 5, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I come back to spare the rod and spoil the child? It's actually not what it says, Peter. It's Proverbs 13:24, and it's whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them.
Oh.
So
okay.
it's become corrupted and truncated in Western thought over time. And it's a trick
Right.
one because I said to John that will come up, but it's actually not in Proverbs. Something like it is in Proverbs, and it's
Kind of.
Proverbs 13:24 if you have a real interest to look it up.
Quite
This is
different.
what I don't understand this one. Proverbs 15, verse 20. A wise man brings joy to his father, but a foolish man despises his mother. Why? Father and mother.
Wow. I mean, that's a classic, you comparing the wise to the foolish, but I don't know what the gender thing is doing in there as well.
Maybe it's actually a feminist kind of thing, saying, you know, if you despise your mother because she's female, you're an idiot.
Okay.
Mm.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
How about the one, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom?
Yeah.
Yes, that's quite well known.
Yeah.
The first verse in Proverbs 27 says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what today will bring, or what a day may bring."
You mightn't be here tomorrow.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But my favourite proverb is actually in chapter 26. Chapter 26 is a whole poem about fools and their folly. And strap yourself in. Chapter 26, verse 11 says, "A fool who reverts to his folly is like a dog that returns to its vomit."
Well, thank you, John, for that
Oh.
image this early in the morning. Good on you.
Yuck.
I just thought. So there's all kinds of gems that you can find in the book of Proverbs.
That's not a gem.
What verse was that?
No, you don't want to know.
26:11.
26.
26:11.
You should all read Proverbs 8, Wisdom's Call. That's a much better thing to read.
Yeah, Proverbs 8 is
Yes.
wonderful. And
a
Proverbs 8
classic.
about wisdom then gets picked up in the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7 onwards, and then in Ecclesiasticus. And there's a whole lot of stuff that develops in Jewish tradition about wisdom. And wisdom, of course, is portrayed as a feminine figure. Some of you from Tuggerah
Yeah.
this kind of stuff with Elizabeth.
Well, we
Um,
know that.
and
Oh,
that's
of course.
in that unfortunately that's in the Apocrypha. Would that were in the canon that we have, but never mind.
Wisdom 8
Okay.
is in our canon.
Sorry?
Wisdom 8 is in our canon.
Wisdom, Proverbs 8, yes.
Proverbs 8, yeah.
Okay, that's Proverbs. Now, what about Ecclesiastes? What's the famous passage that's in the
Time to be born.
Turn,
Time to
turn to everything
That's
there
the
is a
one.
system.
Yes.
Sung very nicely by somebody.
Yeah, a song. Someone sings it in a song.
It is a song.
Yeah.
So your book indicates that Ecclesiastes teaches wisdom from a different perspective, because this is the book that talks about everything being vain, futile, empty, meaningless, just blown in the wind. So the suggestion from the book of Ecclesiastes is that you should seize the day, enjoy the simple pleasures of daily life, eat, drink, and take enjoyment in your wife, or presumably husband, or work. But in the end, all of this is enjoyable for the moment, but utterly is futile. So this book has a very different take on life. It kind of sets it into a cosmic context of insignificance and indeed futility. That's Ecclesiastes.
Right.
The Psalms, we're going to spend the whole session next week on the Psalms, and one type of psalm, there are a number of different types of psalms. One type of psalm is the wisdom psalm. So Psalm 1 is a wisdom psalm because Psalm 1 sets up the wise and the foolish, the wicked and the righteous, the tree with no roots and the tree that has deep roots. And that's precisely how Proverbs operates and how a lot of daily life wisdom operates. So there are other wisdom psalms in the book of Psalms, but a number of other types. And the Psalms deserve a session all on their own. So that's it for them today. We'll come back to them next week. You can have a look ahead in your book if you wish. Now we're going to come to Job, and I want to ask who remembers Natan from the time we were doing translation. From the time we were doing translation real early on in the course. What can we say about Ha-Satan?
The adversary.
Adversary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's who he is. That's right. Anything else about him?
He's commissioned by God.
He's what, sorry, Piers?
He's commissioned by God to
He's
be
commissioned by God.
an adversary to poor old Job.
He certainly is. Any other comments about him?
He reports back to God.
He does report back to God. Is he the personified prince of evil of the New Testament?
No.
No, he isn't. That's right. And that's one of the most important points to remember, that no, he isn't. So most of you seem to have remembered that quite well, because this is going to be important, because we're going to meet him in detail in the book of Job, which we're going to think about now. Has anyone had a look at this material in advance?
Yeah.
Couple of you?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
Yep.
Okay. And have any of you actually taken the trouble to read some of Job?
Yep.
You have. Job is a long book, and it's a complex book, and it raises some really big questions. And it's famous for two things. Well, it was famous for two things when I was in Sunday school and growing up. There's a proverb about the patience of Job. You all have heard about the patience of Job.
Yeah.
It's a saying rather than a proverb.
Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, it's famous more is the machinations of the evil capital S Satan, which we've just established is not actually quite an accurate way of looking at it. But I want to blow these two mythologies apart. One I've already blown apart, the Ha-Satan. He is the adversary, and he's got a devil's advocate job, quite literally, that he's doing with the heavenly council. And the idea that Job is patient, nobody can talk for nearly 30 chapters and rail at God the way Job does and be called patient. Job may be enduring, Job may suffer his affliction and sit down in the dirt, but he never shuts up about his situation and how unfair it is. So if Satan is not the personified force of evil, and that's the book is not about that, and if it's not about the patience of Job, as we're talking about, what is it about? What do you think Job is about?
I think he's a whiner and a sniveler.
He is a whiner, and he does do a bit of snivelling, but he does have good reason to. If your entire family was wiped out in a Holocaust, and then you were inflicted with some evil disease that gave you weeping sores, you would probably feel hard done by the universes, I would suggest.
That's true.
He keeps up his conversation with God.
He does.
That's the thing. That's the thing. I think that's the big theme of Job, that no matter what happens, he's still acknowledging that God's in control. Well, he learns that God's in control, and God's bigger than he is.
Yeah, he does.
He's resilient.
He is very resilient. He manages to survive, though. He doesn't know, of course, there's been a deal made around him with the Ha-Satan and God. And part of the deal is he can be afflicted, but he's not to be killed. And he is blissfully unaware of this, so he's just suffering. What else is Job possibly about?
About how far our understanding is from really God's view of the world.
That's a good point. That's a really good point, Jennifer, because when we come to the final chapters of Job, when a cosmic whirlwind descends on Job and it's God, and God asks Job all these questions, it doesn't seem like a satisfactory answer really to the questions Job has been asking. And God counteracts with a whole pile himself. And we're not left with a great view of the universe really by the end of Job. So that's a good point that you raise. What else? What's it doing? Why is this book being written?
Is there anything about why do bad things happen to good people or not really?
Yes, that is exactly why it's been written. Why do good people suffer and evil goes unpunished? As we've talked about previously in the Pentateuch, the book of Deuteronomy and the law suggests that if you are righteous You will be looked after and you will be rewarded and your crops will be good and your cows will be fertile and you'll have sons, etc. Remember those curses in Deuteronomy and the blessings? So if you're good and follow the law, you'll be blessed. And if you don't follow it and you're not righteous, you'll be cursed. And those curses were pretty
grim.
Yeah, pretty grim and severe. And somewhere along the line, people started noticing that even righteous people seem to be suffering and that there's some really bad dudes out there who are getting away with it. So the book of Job is calling into question what's going on. The author disagrees with this idea that the good are rewarded and the evil are punished, as the Psalms and as many of the Psalms and as the Pentateuch would suggest. And so the author has constructed a debate between God and the adversary and sets a scene for a theological discussion of goodness and evil and why people are good and why people might be bad, and it brings up the whole question of divine punishment. Job is not an historical account. There isn't a real Job sitting down somewhere back in the dim, dark ages. It's a big fable, really. It's a parable. How do I know that? Because it starts in a classic Hebrew style that is the equivalent of once upon a time there was a man named Job. And you'll notice he's set in the land of Uz. He's not set in the land of Israel because you can't make him a Jew for this discussion. The author knows that. So he's not a Jew. He's not in Israel. And it's once upon a time there was this man in this other country who's probably not Jewish, but he's very righteous. And he is the perfect foil to have this big discussion about good and evil and where it comes from. And that's why it is set that way. And it raises this immense question. The Hasatan, when he descends into the heavenly court and God says, well, have you seen your rovings around? Have you seen my righteous servant Job? The Hasatan is basically asking the theological question, is disinterested faith possible without the influence of divine and reward and punishment? That question's on the bottom of page 81 of your books.
What do you mean by this? What is disinterested faith?
That is faith, are we faithful because we've got good things?
All right,
or
yes.
are we faithful because we have this real personal commitment?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what the Hasatan is saying. He's saying, does Job serve you because he's rich and content and happy and has everything he needs? There's nothing to try him. Why would he not serve you, says the Hasatan.
Yeah.
He's got all this good stuff. Of course he's going to worship you.
Yeah.
And, does he really have faith, or is it just that he's comfortable and he's got all these good things and, he's just cruising along like most of our congregations, really? I shouldn't, who think if you turn up to church on Sunday, you somehow have a really good faith. No, you don't. So is disinterested faith possible without the influence of divine reward and punishment? So the flip side of this, of course, is if terrible things happen, do people abandon God? And of course, at the end of the Holocaust, you have a whole lot of Jews that become secular Jews. They abandon their faith. They just can't hold their faith after what happened in World War II and the Holocaust. So divine reward and punishment, and looking at that and looking at good and evil and why it happens, is a discipline in theology known as theodicy. Theo, God, and theodicy, disi, the last word is evil. So, it's about God and evil, I think. I might have got that wrong. Anyway.
No, it's from dike, which is means justice or judgment. So it's God's judgment.
God's judgment, sorry.
God's judgment on evil. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's an interesting discipline to look at. And the book of Job is one of the earliest books we have that explores this. So I'm going to ask you all a question just to think about now. It's on the top of page 82. Would you still have faith without the promise of eternal life as a Christian? I mean, this isn't an issue for Job because there is no eternal life in the Old Testament. But is it an issue for Christians? Would you still have faith without the promise of eternal life?
I never really think
suppose that
about
is-
eternal life.
Okay, sorry, Patricia, then Kate.
I never really think about eternal life. I just think about having faith.
Okay, but Kate.
It's not a hypothetical for me. It's a do. I don't believe there's eternal life, but I still
Have faith.
have. Well, I have a belief in goodness and trying to be a good person.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, that's fine. Any other comments on that? Does anyone feel that they're compelled to be Christian because they need eternal life? And it's all right if you do, because Christians, there's a broad range of theological spectrum with people and what they believe in terms of heaven or even hell. So anyway, it's something for you to think about it. Why do you have your faith? Is it because you've got the promise of something good, or is it because you really believe that you are the good? Is it because that you think there is a God up there and you are bound to follow that God because that God is there? Or is it because Jesus came and through the stories about Jesus, you feel that your faith is nurtured? Is it because you're comfortable and well off in the Western world and we don't have a lot of COVID ravaging us? You know, there's all sorts of ways you can pose this question. And this is the question that's being posed there. And poor old Job, you know, when the adversary says, yes, but does he serve you for naught is kind of what he says. God says, good point, adversary. Go and test him. And they agreed that Job is to be tested rigorously in regard to his faith. And it's a very rigorous test indeed. He's struck down by all this misfortune. He loses his servants, his children, his livestock. All of it is just wiped out. And the advice of his wife at one point is to just curse God and die. But we'll come to that. Mrs. Job is not impressed by what happens. And so we have Job here, and he is having all these bad things happen. But when she says curse God and die, he still does not give up on his faith. And he asks some more questions about that. Can we have the PowerPoint back up again, please, John?
Sure.
So the next question we have is the question that's asked in Job: does God inflict good and bad upon humanity? What do you reckon?
I don't think God does.
If he's not an intercession, if he's not someone who interferes with what's going on in the world, he can't do either of those things.
No, he can't. But that's one point of view. So you're saying that he's a God that's a hands-off kind of God.
Yeah.
So that's why he can't do either. Do other people have a point of view about that? Does God inflict good and or bad upon humanity?
I think that we have choice, and so there's a fair bit of goodness and badness which arises in the world because people have choices, and sometimes they make bad choices, and also there are other forces like the weather that just happen, and illness, and they're not necessarily inflicted by God, but are the result of our own mortality as humans.
Yep, so we have pandemics, we have viruses, we have bacteria, we have earthquakes and tsunamis and floods and all sorts of things and calamities that come upon us that we would not necessarily see at all that they're being inflicted by God. They're just part of how the world works.
And God is with it. Is with
they're
us.
Not inflicted. They're not by chance. They're inflicted by the way the human beings behave in this world.
Not all of them are, Piers. I mean, earthquakes have been happening for millennia. And when tectonic plates collide and have been colliding for decades, it's not because of anything we're doing. That's just what they do.
Yeah, I accept that. But I think many
things, of course, that have been exacerbated by climate change. You know, our dreadful fires, the terrible flooding, these 1 in 100 year events that are now 1 in 4 year events. You know, yes, we have brought that on ourselves. But the actual storms and the actual floods and the actual fires, without that severity increase, have been around since we have. They've been around before we have. So they're just there. And I mean, when you read the Bible, it's clear that things like that happened back in those times, and ancient literature also talks about them as well. So what do you think the Bible's view is of this? What do you think the Old Testament's view is of this? Does God inflict good and bad upon humanity?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
He did.
Anyone disagree with yes?
Maybe not all of it, like some of it. Some things you can say, well, some things the Old Testament says was a punishment from God or a blessing. But I don't think you can say that the Old Testament says everything bad is a punishment from God.
Okay. And can we move on to our next slide, John? I can't remember what it is. This is the first one I want you to look at. I've referred to this. Then his wife said to him, do you still persist in your integrity? That's after all her children have been struck dead. Curse God and die. And he says to her, you speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? So Job clearly thinks that good and bad comes from God. And is this repeated elsewhere in the Bible? Well, as it happens, it is. We find it later on in Isaiah. I form light and create darkness. I make weal, which is a stupid old word for peace because they want some rhyming things in the NRSV. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. So clearly there is the belief that what is good and what is bad emanates from God. And of course, there's a reason for this. If there's only one God, where is the bad coming from? So if you are truly monotheistic and you're in the Old Testament, then you've only got one God. So if bad things happen, well, that God must have caused them to happen. If good things happen, that God must have caused them to happen. As Christians, we're not that keen on that idea, which is why you get the rise of the devil into the figure he becomes in the New Testament. And he takes all the bad stuff off God. So God can be a being of light and love, and the devil takes all the nasty things. But in the Old Testament, that is not the case. God has good and bad. And our next, and then we get from Job again. It is all one, therefore I say, he is God. He destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. So not only does God send calamity, he finds it funny. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He, that's God, covers the eyes of its judges. And then the big question is, if it's not he, then who is it? So if the bad stuff's not coming from God, then where is it coming from? That's a rhetorical question.
I love
in
it.
The Old Testament, of course, there is no one else.
I like
So
covers the eyes of the judges.
what was that, Piers?
I like the way he covers the eyes of the judges.
Yes.
In other words, the judges are partly responsible for the damage that they're doing to the poor people who come before them and are given incorrect judgments.
Well, they do, but he's partly to blame because that's God doing the covering.
Yes.
So, you know, it's basically what Job is suggesting here is God is implicated in all of this. And that's why he asked this rhetorical question. If it is not God, then who is it?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting book, as you can see, and it's tackling this really big question. Now, when was Job written, I Hear You Cry? Probably sometime after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. And as I've mentioned, it deliberately avoids any identifying historical features that could place it somewhere because it is a fable and it's about complex issues. It's full of clever wordplays. It's got heaps of irony. It's intentionally ambiguous. So it's a very interesting book, and it can make us as Christians today exploring the workings of the mind of God as presented in Job incredibly uncomfortable. But it does not seem to worry this particular Hebrew theologian. And we've had, I mean, there's a lot of questions about the workings of divine in the Old Testament. We find them in the Psalms where it says, do not let the downtrodden be put to shame. Let the poor and needy praise your name. Rise up, God, and plead your cause. Or do not let my enemies rejoice over me. They open wide their mouths and say, aha. Aha is a, how do I explain it? It's a strange little Hebrew word that means meh, 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 meh. They say, ha ha, our eyes have seen it. You have seen, O Lord. Do not be silent. Wake up. Bestir yourself in my defense and vindicate me. So there's this puzzle of the suffering of the righteous. And what are we going to do about it? So the author of Job has set himself a really, really big task. He's going to explore the truth that the innocent, not just the wicked, do suffer. And he's going to attempt to explain the rationale for God's action in regard to such suffering. And by mostly laying the blame squarely at God's door. And I mean, there's a bit of blame laid at the Hasatan's jaw, but it's God's decision to let the adversary do what he does. So in addition to the questions of good and evil, the book of Job also attempts to explore the theological issue posed by the adversary. As I said, is disinterested faith possible without the influence of divine reward and punishment? So why shouldn't Job be righteous? Why shouldn't he believe in God if there's wealth and he's got a prosperous family and lots of sons? Why is Job really believing? So he's to be tested rigorously in regard to his faith. And this isn't where we like to think of a loving, merciful Christian God. The one we know and love doesn't behave like this. Here is a God who knows his human servant is righteous, yet he's quite happy to gamble with his feelings, his faith, the life of his family, the life of his slaves and servants, his livestock, in order to allow the adversary's claim to be tested. So, is it a fair representation of God? Do we think God tests the faith of humanity? And we're going to go in our breakout rooms now. And we've got, I'm going to put you in there. At the bottom of page 82, you'll see there's some questions. That's John's got them up now. How do you understand suffering in life? What part does God play in your understanding? Do you believe adverse circumstances are God's way of testing or punishing us? Now, you can do them in any order, or you can pick one, or you can just do them as a part of a whole as you talk together. I don't mind. But we're going to use this book to think about some of these issues. Is everyone clear what they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
You are? Okay, I'm going to put you in there for 12 minutes. So I'm going to open rooms. Don't forget to click join. Are you all exhausted from that conversation?
Oh, definitely.
Yes.
I know you should be. I'm not going to ask to give you feedback, for you to give feedback for that, because they're not really exegetical or critical questions. It's really how you're interacting with the text and sharing that with each other. So we're going to move on looking at Job, and I'll just put my video back on. So you're looking at me and not whoever it is I've got up. I don't know if it's Junia or one of those from our Bible studies. So that's what we just talked about. And of course, in the Western world, we still hear some of this stuff. We still hear things like God tests our faith. You'll still hear some fundamentalists say things like that tsunami was punishing people because there's gay people in that area.
That's a load of rubbish, isn't it?
Of course it's a load of rubbish. But it does still come out. So,
Yeah.
and there is an idea that you'll read at times that God doesn't send anything that we can't handle. And I think that's a load of rubbish as well, quite frankly. Because if we have a look at poor humanity, if God really does test humanity through harshness and adversity and poverty, you have to ask, who is the ones in the world suffering the most from such things? And the answer would be black third world children under the age of 10.
Yes.
Because they die in their tens of thousands. And you would have to ask, if God wants to test humanity, why God has a particular penchant for testing small, poverty-stricken black children under the age of 10. So
But he's also
it's a problem.
testing us too by that. What can we do about it?
I don't think he's testing us about anything, simply because to say that 15,000 children die every day so the white Western world can have a test to rise to the occasion isn't good enough. That's a lot of deaths so we can learn something.
Well, we don't learn it, do we?
No, we don't. But that doesn't mean that people have to keep being sacrificed on the altar until we do, does it?
No.
What sort of a God does that? So the Odyssey is a fraught discipline. When you get into it, you'll find a lot of the things you thought you knew will suddenly go down the toilet. It's like free will. Don't get me started on the doctrine of free will, because I'll be here forever and you'll probably go with your ears ringing somewhere, so that's not good.
If Elizabeth talks about free will, you'll have no choice. You will have to listen to it.
That's right. There'll be no free will exercise while I am talking about it. So, while there's no doubt certain forms of suffering do strengthen us and can bring us closer to God and teach us things, the suffering experienced by poor humanity does not have these outcomes. And it exists as an indictment of greed and indifference of the first world rather than God is testing anybody. So one of the greatest differences between us and the author of Job is the belief is God is responsible for such suffering. We like to let God off the hook. We talk about the doctrines of free will, where the actions and selfishness of individuals or the first world or somebody are seen to cause the extraordinary death toll in the world from war, disease and poverty, particularly in the developing world. We let God off the hook when we declare God suffers with such people, because God's doing an awful lot of suffering with black children under 10, and you have to ask yourself why. Maybe God does suffer with such people, but we let God off the hook when we say it's all right because God's suffering with them. No, it's not all right. It is not all right they're dying like that.
What do you mean by God suffering with them when you say that? Like,
sorry?
What do you mean by that phrase, God is, it's all right because God is suffering with them? I know you're trying to say.
It's a theology. Theologians have no life, so they invent stuff. And one of the things they do is process theology. Process theology said God, as Piers indicated, does not actively interfere in human activities, either because he can't or he won't. And if you say he won't, you've got another problem there, because why won't he when all this suffering's going on? If you say he can't, which the process theologians would say, they say God suffers with us, that Jesus crucified as a human suffered and understands suffering, and therefore God understands suffering. So when bad things happen, God can't prevent them, but God cries with us and suffers alongside of us, and God understands the awfulness of human condition. So that's what that particular branch of theology says. But the only way that branch of theology can get things right is by an eschaton or a parousia, that is some sort of judgment or second coming, where all those suffering poor black children under 10 get some sort of elevated status in heaven. And that's the best that process theologians can do. And I say to them, not good enough, but that's just me. Because if that's what we're relying on, a second coming that says, I'm going to make it all right for the souls of those thousands and thousands of children who died, we're on tenuous ground there. Anyway, I digress. Back to Job, who agrees with me. Yes, a man after my own heart. The great misfortune which has struck Job, which includes the stealing of his animals, killing of his servants, destruction of his children, are not blamed initially on an unjust God. Job still blesses God. So we have the scenario repeating itself in the heavenly council. The adversary comes back and God says, ha ha, I told you so. And the adversary says, ha, but if we make Job himself suffer and his actual person is attacked, then maybe he will curse you. So God agrees again, and Job is afflicted with terrible sores. He ignores the counsel of his wife to curse God and die, as we've seen, and he still persists in his faith. So Job then finds himself being not only counseled by his wife, but he has his 3 friends come along and want to tell him things. But Job is convinced he doesn't have a hidden sin. There isn't something he's inherited from his father, as some of the Deuteronomic writings would suggest. Job says he's innocent and he wants a day in court. So a lot of the book is constructed around this day in court. He envisages a heavenly trial where he can put his case directly to God. And there's lots of subtle word plays that go on these chapters. Job is a magnificent book for literary devices, for irony, for wonderful word plays, and all sorts of interesting things. For instance, Job says he doesn't know the way to God's abode, and there's a play on the way, the word way, because God knows the way to Job, as he does all humans whose destinies he ultimately controls. Ironically, God knows Job has kept God's way, as is made clear in the beginning of the book. Yet keeping the way is apparently not enough for Job to find the way to good fortune and avoid misfortune and keep that at bay. So Job's 3 friends turn up to console with him. They do not waver in their belief that God is right, and anyone who has experienced such dire misfortune as Job has undoubtedly been punished. They say Job has secretly disobeyed God's law, and they berate him for refusing to confess his sins, as they are convinced he must have committed. They don't know what these sins might be. They know Job quite well, but they persist in believing there must be something secret going on to deserve all of this punishment. And in their simplistic theology of God, they believe God rewards the good and punishes the evil, and no exceptions are allowed. So there's no room in their understanding about God having some sort of divine discretion and mystery in allowing and arranging suffering for purposes other than retribution. So what these friends are for, the author of Job is using them to expose the inadequacies of the tradition that we have seen in Deuteronomy. Their arguments might sound convincing and consoling, but they're simplistic. They don't get the divine truth, and they don't understand that divine truth is actually beyond human understanding. They expect salvation from God will take the form of well-being in life, and they believe it is they who defends the workings of God. Of course, by the end, we know that's not true. And Job counters their arguments with some pretty stark statements about the injustices of God. So Job believes God is omnipotent. So if God is omnipotent, the question is, why isn't he using his power to right wrongs, punish the wicked, and ensure justice is done? Look at the end of chapter 12, and I'm going to read you a quote from chapter 12. The Lord makes nations great, then he destroys them. He strips understanding from the leaders of the earth and makes them wander in a pathless waste. They grope in the dark without light. He makes them stagger like drunkards. So this is Job's take on God, and it's a pretty dark one. So Job, whether he realises it or not, has engaged himself in the study of theodicy, where the theological examination of how a loving, just and all-powerful God can allow suffering and evil to exist. Job appears to be the first theologian that we know of to begin to ask some of these questions about theodicy. And there's an excellent quote from David Hume, and he sums up these questions with these 3 so-called attributes of God, that is, justice, loving, all-powerful. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both willing and able? And if he is, why is there evil? Good questions, I hear you cry. And ones that have plagued and puzzled theologians for many, many decades and will continue to do so. So Job, and there's other things that goes on in Job. Do you all know the book of Psalms where it says, what are we mortals? We're just mere flowers. Our lifetime is like the grass. We fade away and wither. Do you all know that psalm?
That's chapter 14.
Yeah. But God still loves us. But in Job reverses that. This is one of the clever things it does. And he makes fun of that psalm. Let me alone, for my days are a breath. What are human beings that you make so much of them, that you set your mind on them? You visit them every morning. You test them every moment. Won't you look away for a while? Let me alone until I swallow my spittle. Why have you made me your target? Why have I become a burden to you? So there's lots of stuff like this in Job, where they've taken that quite beautiful psalm that says, despite how fragile and fleeting we are, God still loves us. And Job has said, I am fragile and fleeting, so nick off. Why should you be interested in me? Stop looking at me. So it's a complete parody of the whole concept that that particular psalm raises, because Job would rather found that God found mortals much less important. He thinks God has better things to do than annoy him. To be watched by the divine in the Bible is a fearful and potentially dangerous thing, and Job knows it. And he knows he's being treated like an enemy of cosmic proportions with his punishment. Job moves back from no longer being prepared to bless the name of God. He starts asking why. And Job's problem is that God, being the force behind cosmic law, has all the power on his side. So Job is presenting an old age problem of power and justice. That's another thing this book raises. Those who have been the victim of an unjust power, whether divine or human, can't really appreciate the insecurity that capricious power and denial of rights will generate. And Job starts to think about that and see himself as a victim here. And this aspect of Job is pretty disturbing, really. There is no doubt that what has happened thus far to Job is absolutely unfair. It's been the result of a bet between the adversary and God. Why should a blameless and upright man who feared God be made to suffer so? And the only free will you can use to blame here is God's. The decision to test Job was God's alone. So here we have a God with a apparent dark side who willingly allows a family to be struck dead, of a person who only has God's goodness at heart, who has done no wrong, who has been afflicted with a dreadful disease, deprived of his farm and a means to make a living. How do we hold to the idea of this all-loving God when these kinds of things not only happen to Job, but happen routinely in our world today? And suffering and death often strike when least expected. So, is there an answer to the end of this story? What happens at the end? Has anyone read the end of the book of Job?
He gets all his wealth back and lots of children.
Plus
Well,
more.
he does right at the end, but before we kind of get to that, what happens?
God puts him in his place, doesn't he?
God does put him in his place. That is a really good way of putting it. There's a fourth friend who comes in. He's an interesting character. His name is Elihu, and his name means my God is he. And he's so angry, the Hebrew says his nose burns. And he gives everyone a serve about what's going on. At the end of this serve, it's a faint mirroring of what's going to happen later. Up pops a whirlwind of cosmic proportions that starts roaring round Job. So, and Job had said just before that, he said, if I summoned him, that's God, and he answered me, I do not believe he would listen to my voice, for he tramples me down with a whirlwind, enlarges my wounds for no reason, will not let me get my breath. And God appears to enact precisely that. And he turns up to tell Job a few things and asks him impossible questions that only a God could answer. Where is the beginning of the ends of the earth? Where does the dawn come from? Did you make the eagle? What about Leviathan and Behemoth, the monsters in the waters of chaos? Can you pet them?
We're going to get bus to go and get the car and come back.
You know, can you do various things with them?
15 minutes and I can take you there.
So,
as you wish.
Yeah.
God puts before Job all these cosmic matters, including Job's own smallness and frailness, and he reminds Job twice to gird his loins like a man, and I'm going to ask you questions, and you can try and instruct me. This God is very sarcastic. He's incredibly ironic, and he's not that nice, really. So gird the loins is usually a metaphor for preparing for battle, and that is exactly what is about to happen to the unfortunate Job, who's been told he darkens counsel with ignorant words and has a whirlwind of cosmic proportions roaring around him. To say God has stacked the deck here would be an understatement. It's a contest that God is going to win. So God's words take Job from the bottom of the deep to the heights of the heavens and all over the earth. And there's all sorts of things that God points out. God does answer Job, but the answer is not what Job expected. Job thought that this was black and white. There's justice, there's good, there's bad, there's punishment, there's reward. God should do one and not the other. God should take into account what people are doing. And God says, I don't think so. And he presents a universe that doesn't run on those rules. He says, that's your rules, Job, but the way the universe runs is quite different. And it's a very ambiguous and immoral universe that the whirlwind presents to Job. And he talks about, one, he says, humans are not the centre of my interest, because he makes the point that the rain falls where humans aren't. And that might seem an insignificant verse, but in the Old Testament, when he says that, he says, I make it rain where no humans dwell. He is making the point that humans are not the centre of everything. He says things like, the ostrich lays its eggs in a nest to be trampled by the wild horse or the wild donkeys. Bad luck, ostrich. That's what happens. He points out that the wild ass has freedom to roam around, but that also means it has the freedom to be the lion's dinner, and it may get eaten. This is a universe where there's chaos and there's random elements and bad things happen to innocent eggs and innocent donkeys, because that's just the way it's constructed. And Job's black and white morality that he fervently believed in is just dissolved before this random, chaotic and ambiguous universe that is presented by this rather capricious deity that's roaring at him. So the speeches of God illustrate the world according to Hebrew cosmology. Everything's ordered and has its place, but there's all these disorderly elements that can't be accounted for. Beasts have hunter and prey in their numbers, that God provides them both. And in his ignorance, as I said, Job has this black and white world where evil and good and reward and punishment are clearly defined. But God points to the natural world and said, sorry, it just doesn't work like that. So proud war horses can be killed by arrows despite their strength and courage. So the world as God has created it has order and chaos, life and death, random victors and victims. And Job's assumption of a just universe is rendered meaningless. And that's a very big thing for us to come to grips with this book. And though it begins with deprivation and tragedy, despite Job's implied arrogance in his loud declarations throughout the book, God nonetheless restores to him a new family and possessions, leaving some of us, like me, the more sceptical among us, wondering what about his dead children and servants? They do not seem to have fared well in the happy ending department. And though the restoration is abundant, with Job receiving back twice as he had lost, it's still left with a feeling, this book, it's a feeling of dissatisfaction. Has Job's question really been answered? And despite the great supreme power of God, there's something still to find about Job. And this is one of the great mistranslations of the age. All of your books will say that Job repents in sackcloth and ashes if you read the end of Job. You've all heard that phrase?
Yeah.
Job repents in sackcloth and ashes. That is not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says Job repents of sackcloth and ashes. In the last great act of defiance, by the judicious changing of a preposition, Job still has something to say to God. He repents of sackcloth and ashes, but he knows he's outwitted and outgunned, so he just shuts up. And with a final touch of irony, the friends who wanted Job to plead for God's mercy for himself now find themselves at the mercy of Job. It's God says, if you pray for them, I will forgive them. So it seems a happy ending, but is it? And even though the adversary has lost the bet, he never comes back. And we're just left with all of these unanswerable questions.
And wouldn't there also be the feeling of, will it happen again?
Well, exactly. That is one of the problems of it. With a God that is unpredictable and capable of abandoning frail humanity at the drop of a hat to a dreadful fate, what do you believe? That's probably why Job doesn't actually prevent. And even though restitution is made to him, we've still got this universe of moral ambiguity. He could still be wiped out at any given time. We don't know. So I don't know what we're to make of this. It's a very difficult book in that sense about how what it's meant to tell us. In
Yes.
Christians, we believe that in the midst of suffering, God does come to the afflicted and firm the presence of grace, and that is the whole point of Jesus. But this is not what we're getting in Job, really. And part of the power of the book of Job is the fact it realistically addresses these painful questions of life. Tragedy and suffering are not simple. They challenge faith. They create a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. There's no shortage of opinions on trying to explain, and others like explaining to people in pain why they have pain or don't have pain or why they should put up with it. And simplistic answers are often given in response to these really life questions that are really quite painful. And the strength of the book of Job, I guess, is it allows all sides of the issue, simple answers, the emotional turmoil of Job to be heard and heard and heard and heard again. You can get exasperated with Job. It seems to go on and repeats the same arguments, but despite not providing a definitive answer, it does actually express the way the problem of suffering is experienced. We just repeat it over and over and over again, especially when it comes to the enormous issues of world poverty and economic injustice. And we can ponder the idea raised by the adversary for us in the first world. Is it easier to have faith and worship God when things are going well for us? I suspect the answer to that probably is yes. And Job is trying to encourage us to look for what hope we can in the midst of adversity, find strength under fire, and maybe look beyond ourselves. So, you know, we might not like the answers, but there is in Job the idea that at least we're heard. I'm not sure how consoling that actually is with this particular book. So what are we to make of Job? We had some questions on the bottom of page 83. We've got a little bit of time left. And so I might put you into groups again just to briefly talk about this. So John's got it up there, Job 42, about Job repenting of sackcloth and ashes, not in them. There it is. And that's a really important point. And then we have our next slide with these questions on it. What do we make of this picture of God? Do we have the right to question the workings of God as Job did? And how do we understand order and chaos in our lives? So bottom of page 83, you'll find them, and I'll pop you into your breakout rooms to have a nice discussion, brief discussion about these questions. Okay, off you go.
For all of you, that hell is a lake of burning sulphur, because I have been personally consigned there on numerous occasions over the last decade by an authority who knows.
Oh, you're talking about our friend, yes.
Our friend whose name shall not be mentioned.
No, he shall not be mentioned. He's put John and I in hell on, as John said, on numerous occasions. He's told us that's where we're off to, that we're doomed and we'll burn
eternally.
Forever. Eternally, we will burn forever. Yeah.
All right.
It's just, I don't have answers for you folks because I'm not the whirlwind. And it's just a book that isn't meant to give you answers. It just raises questions that'll make you think. And that's what Job is actually designed to do. It's a dark, very clever parable. And there is no real happy ending. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Don't thank you after that statement. Was there irony in that?
I think so.
Yes.
Be happier than the middle.
I mean, I love the book of Job. I love it because it's so dark and it's so testing. That's why I like it. I don't have the answers to what it raises at all, but, you know, it's so challenging and it's really pushed me to think.
Yeah.
And that's what I
You
like
just
about
wonder
it.
about the elders who decided that Job should go into the Bible. Like, what kind of? It'd be interesting to be a fly on the wall when they made that decision. You know,
That's a good question, Peter. How on earth did Job get in there? You have to wonder. How did Job make the canon? that, you know, even a Book of Ruth, the sweet Book of Ruth, which we will look at later, which you probably all have read and loved, I'm going to deconstruct it for you in a way that by the end of it, you're going to be just as bamboozled. Because it's wisdom literature, and wisdom literature is never what it seems. It always operates at all these different layers.
Mm.
And that's what I like about it. It's complex, it's dark, it's funny. There's a lot of funny stuff in wisdom that you don't get often with translations. So I'm sure you will look forward to that. So next week, what are we doing next week, John?
Psalms.
Psalms. Next week, we'll be doing Psalms. And there'll be dark and light in that, and that will probably please you all because we all like the Psalms, don't we?